The Florida humidity usually smells of salt air, but on this August night, it was dense with the metallic scent of blood. When the initial deputy entered into the driveway, the flashlight beam exposed a scene that defied every law of nature. A young man, muscular, barely clothed, was bent over a still body. He wasn't merely attacking. He was ripping at the victim's face with his teeth, growling through a mouthful of human flesh. It took 4 officers and a K-9 to pull this golden boy away from a meal he claimed was something else entirely. To the residents in Jupiter, Florida, Austin Harrouff was the living embodiment of the suburban dream. Born on December 21, 1996 in Palm Beach Gardens, he grew up in a world of groomed lawns and career success. His father, Wade, was a prominent local dentist, a man often described as loud and diligent, while his mother, Mina, was the caring core of the family home. For years, the Harrouff household appeared steady, anchored by the expectations of high achievement that come with a comfortable middle-class upbringing. Austin and his younger sister, Haley, were close, navigating a childhood that seemed, by all accounts, unremarkable in its normalcy. However, the quiet facade began to show its first hairline fractures when Austin was 13, as his parents navigated a divorce that split his world in two. Despite the separation, Austin remained high-achieving, enrolling at Suncoast Community High School, a prestigious magnet school known for its strict academic standards. He wasn't just a face in the crowd. He was a 3.3 GPA student who found his footing through the raw physicality of high school sports. Initially, a shy and reserved freshman, he transformed himself through the wrestling team and the football field, using the weight room to carve out a new, more confident identity. During his final year, he had exchanged his teenage insecurity for a muscular physique and a social group that viewed him as a golden boy, the type of kid destined for a bright future in medicine or sports science. This route brought him to Florida State University in Tallahassee, where he first chose a major in biology. He entered the Alpha Delta Phi fraternity, deeply immersing himself in the typical American college experience: tailgating, fraternity parties, and the pressure to maintain a specific alpha persona. Yet under the surface of the gym photos and the 3.3 college GPA, a deeper, more intricate shift was forming. By the close of his first year, the social atmosphere of the fraternity house started to fade. Austin became tired of the alcohol scene, and his attention moved from social advancement to an almost compulsive fixation with his own body. He switched his major to exercise science and started a campaign for purity. His YouTube channel, formerly a space for typical fitness guidance under the username @_Harrouff, started to upload clips that seemed progressively detached from reality. Within those videos, he would frequently gaze into the lens with an intensity that disturbed audiences, explaining his choice to quit training because he no longer wanted to follow the group. He talked about his inner conflicts and an increasing urge for an unclear, elevated state of being. His relatives observed he was growing progressively isolated, his emotions fluctuating between profound, inaccessible depressions and episodes of manic energy that his father would eventually identify as signs of bipolar disorder. As the summer of 2016 rolled around, the decline accelerated into a freefall. The young man who once worried about his bench press was now preoccupied with ancient religions and demonic hallucinations. He began researching Krishna, Buddhism, and the life of Jesus, convinced that he was developing special abilities that set him apart from the human race. His paranoia grew so thick that he could no longer sleep at night, fearing that something was coming for him in the darkness. He told those close to him that he felt invincible, a grandiosity that masked a terrifying fracture in his psyche. Perhaps the most chilling sign of his impending break was his burgeoning belief in clinical lycanthropy. Austin began to tell people that he felt half man and half dog, a delusion that took a physical form when he insisted on wearing a Michael Vick jersey. To Austin, the garment wasn't just sports apparel. He believed it allowed him to channel dog spirits that gave him strength. His mother, Mina, watched in horror as her son's behavior grew more erratic by the hour. At one point, he was found in her kitchen manically drinking vegetable oil, his eyes vacant, and his mind seemingly miles away from the Jupiter suburbs he called home. He was discarding his drugs and his supplements in a desperate bid for purity, unaware that the very mind he was trying to cleanse was already beginning to consume itself. While the storm of Austin Harrouff's psyche was gathering force a few miles away, the world on Kokomo Lane remained bathed in the slow, rhythmic comfort of a South Florida evening. That was the realm of 59-year-old John Stevens III and his 53-year-old wife, Michelle Mishkan. both individuals who had spent decades intertwining themselves into the very fabric of the Jupiter and Tequesta community. To know them was to comprehend a particular type of regional hospitality, one that didn't require an invitation or a formal occasion. They were the moorings of their neighborhood, a couple whose presence felt as permanent and reliable as the tides of the Loxahatchee River nearby. Michelle was a lady of lively energy, a force of nature who carried the legacy of her father, Jeff Mishkan, a former mayor of North Miami Beach. She had inherited his civic spirit and a deep-rooted belief in the importance of community, though she chose to exercise it through personal connection rather than political office. Friends often noted that her laugh could be heard from several houses away, a loud, contagious sound that signaled everything was right in the world. She operated in the finance department of a local company, but her real calling was the life she shared with John. She was the organizer, the one who ensured the refrigerator was always filled and that every neighbor felt seen. John, 14 years her senior, was her ideal counterbalance. A former entrepreneur with a fondness for the modest pleasures of the Florida lifestyle, he was frequently portrayed as the classic gentleman of the coast. He was a man of the water, content when the sun was on his back and a fishing line was in the water. He took great pride in his daughter, Ivy, and the life he had built after years of professional strength. John didn't need to be the loudest person in the room, because his calm confidence and gentle smile did the work for him. He held a safeguarding instinct that was never domineering, only a constant, composed certainty that he was present for those he loved. Together, they had built something famed in their quiet cul-de-sac, the garage bar. It wasn't a venture, and it certainly wasn't a secret. It was simply their open garage converted into a shared living room for the entire street. They had furnished the space with cozy couches, a large television, and a stocked refrigerator, converting a utilitarian storage area into the heart of Kokomo Lane. On any given night, the garage door would be rolled up, exposing the warm glow of the TV and the silhouette of the couple sitting together, usually with their beloved dog, Fisher, resting at their feet. The garage bar was a haven for the neighborhood. It was the spot where people stopped during their evening walks to talk about the news, complain about the heat, or celebrate a local sports win. John and Michelle didn't only tolerate these interruptions, they embraced for them. They formed a space where the barriers between neighbors faded. There was no need to knock. If the lamp was on and the door was up, the bar was open. The air in that space often carried of salt spray, citronella candles, and the faint, sweet scent of the nearby tropical foliage. It was a sensory marker for everyone on the block, a symbol of safety in a world that often felt increasingly isolated. The couple's relationship was a tribute to enduring partnership. They were often seen together, whether they were taking their boat out for a sunset cruise or just running errands around town. Neighbors noticed that they seemed to have found a rare rhythm, a way of moving through life that was harmonized and devoid of the friction that wore down other marriages. They were that couple, the ones younger pairs looked to as an example of how to grow older without losing the spark of true friendship. In the weeks leading up to that August night, the atmosphere at the garage bar had been as vibrant as ever. Michelle had been occupied with her job and her community circles, always the first to extend a hand or a kind word to someone in distress. John had been enjoying his retirement, maintaining the home and the boat with the careful attention of a man who valued what he had earned. They were content, they were settled. They were fully unaware that the very openness they cherished, the open garage door that signaled their care for their neighbors, would soon become the entry for an unimaginable horror. The tragedy of John and Michelle lies not just in their deaths, but in the vibrant, generous lives that were interrupted. They represented the best of suburban life, the belief that your neighbor is your friend and that your home is a place of peace. On Kokomo Lane, the garage bar wasn't just a place to get a drink. It was a proof to the idea that a community is built one talk at a time, one open door at a time. As the sun began to set on August 15th of 2016, the ice was in the cooler. The TV was tuned to the evening news, and the couple sat in their usual spots, enjoying the cool air of the Florida twilight, blissfully ignorant that the golden boy from a few miles away was already wandering into the darkness, shedding his humanity with every step he took toward their driveway. The warmth on August 15, 2016, was a bodily weight, the kind of heavy, dense air that clings to the skin and makes every movement feel like a battle against the atmosphere itself. In Jupiter, Florida, the summer nights rarely offer relief, and for Austin Harroof, the temperature seemed to reflect the rising pressure inside his skull. That night began with a semblance of home routine, a family dinner at Duffy's Sports Grill. Austin sat with his father, Wade, and his sister, but the young man who sat the chair was not the son Wade remembered. He was agitated, his eyes darting across the room, his body shaking with a manic energy that made the ordinary setting of a sports bar feel dangerously volatile. The conflict ignited nearly immediately. Austin's conduct was unstable, interrupted by bizarre outbreaks and an unsettling obsession on the pace of the service. At one point, he allegedly grew so irritated with the wait for his food that he tried to eat a bowl of salad dressing, or, according to some accounts, tried to consume a piece of plastic. The shift from a college athlete to a person losing their grip on shared reality was happening in real time, right across the table from his family. When Wade tried to interpose, attempting to steady his son, or perhaps just demanding a restoration to proper decorum, the snapping point finally arrived. Austin didn't just dispute, he exploded. He rose up, shoved back from the table, and exited out of the restaurant into the humid twilight, leaving his family sitting in the shocked quietness of the dining room. His father, seized by a rising feeling of fear, pursued him out, but Austin was already moving with a driven, hasty gait. He wasn't just moving, he was escaping from a reality he could no longer negotiate. For a short period of time, Austin's movements were followed by his family and the digital trail of a distressed mother. He went his path to his mother Mina's house, situated a few miles away. It was there that the cleansing fixation took a truly grotesque turn. Mina found her son in the kitchen, his eyes empty, frantically consuming vegetable oil from a bottle. He was searching for a way to cover his interior, to purify, or perhaps to facilitate a shift he believed was happening within his very DNA. When his mother tried to halt him, he pushed past her, heading back out into the night. The walk from his mother's house toward what would become the crime scene covered roughly 3.12 miles. During this trek, the shift from Austin Aroof, the FSU student, to something predator began to solidify. The Florida night was dense with the sounds of insects and the distant hum of traffic on the turnpike, but Austin's internal landscape was filled with the echoes of gods and the growls of animals. He began to discard the trappings of his human identity. He tore off his shirt, the Michael Vick jersey he believed held spiritual power, and eventually his shorts, wandering through the manicured suburbs of Jupiter in nothing but his underwear and a Make America Great Again hat he had picked up along the way. As he walked, his mind was a kaleidoscope of delusions. He later told investigators that he felt like he was being chased by shadow people, dark entities that were nipping at his heels and demanding a sacrifice. He believed he was a superhuman, a being of ancient power who was finally shedding the weak skin of his suburban upbringing. Every shadow cast by a palm tree, every flicker of a street lamp, was interpreted as a sign or a threat. He was no longer navigating a neighborhood, he was traversing a mythological battlefield where he was both the hero and the monster. The path eventually led him to Kokomo Lane, a quiet cul-de-sac where the houses were spaced comfortably apart and the sense of security was absolute. It was roughly 9:15 p.m. The street was dim, save for the cozy, inviting glow emanating from the garage of house number 603. This was the garage bar of John Stevens and Michelle Mishcon. The garage door was up, a signal of hospitality in the darkness. Inside, the couple was doing exactly what they always did, sitting on their couch, watching television and enjoying the evening air. To Austin, this scene wasn't a domestic idol, it was a target. The open door represented a breach in the world, an entrance into a space where he could finally confront the darkness he felt chasing him. He turned into the driveway, his feet slapping against the concrete. He wasn't running yet, but his posture was hunched, his movements predatory. He didn't say a word as he crossed the threshold of the garage. The transition from the quiet hum of the television to the sounds of a life-and-death struggle was instantaneous. Michelle Mishcon was the first to see him. She likely didn't even have time to stand before the figure in the red hat was upon her. The violence was not a clean, clinical act. It was a chaotic, visceral eruption of rage. Austin used whatever was at hand, his own fists, his teeth, and a pocket knife he had been carrying. The initial attack on Michelle was fast and brutal. John Stevens, seeing his wife under attack, did exactly what his neighbors knew he would do. He fought back with everything he had. He stepped between the intruder and his wife, a 59-year-old man, trying to fend off a 19-year-old athlete who was currently experiencing a surge of manic strength that made him feel invincible. Outside, the neighborhood remained quiet for a few more seconds. A cricket chirped in the bushes. A car door slammed 3 houses down. And then, The silence of Kokomo Lane was shattered by a scream so high and so full of terror that it cut through the walls of the surrounding homes. It was a sound that didn't belong in a Jupiter suburb, a primal cry of help that signaled the arrival of something ancient and terrible. A neighbor, Jeff Fisher, heard the commotion and didn't hesitate. He ran toward the Stevens home, thinking perhaps a domestic accident had occurred or a burglar had been caught. As he approached the garage, he saw a scene that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He saw a young man hunched over John Stevens, a figure that seemed more like a wild animal than a person. When Fisher tried to intervene, Austin didn't flee. He turned on Fisher with a snarl, lunging at him with a knife in a ferocity that forced the neighbor to retreat. Bleeding from his own wounds, Fisher scrambled back to his house, his hands shaking as he dialed 911, telling the dispatcher that there was a zombie or a madman killing his neighbors. Inside the garage, the struggle continued. Austin was no longer using just the knife. He was using his body as a weapon, his mind fully submerged in the delusion that he was an animal. He started to gnaw and rip at John Stevens, who was now still on the floor. There was no sense to the attack, no reason of robbery or revenge. It was the raw, pure expression of a mind that had finally, irreversibly broken. The favored boy was gone, and in his place sat a figure in a red hat, covered in the blood of two people who had done nothing more than leave their garage door open on a humid Monday night. The initial sirens were a cry of sanity trying to reclaim a street that had fallen into the prehistoric. Jeff Fisher, clutching a jagged bleeding wound on his face where Austin had lunged at him, was still on the line with dispatch. His voice was a panicked staccato, a blend of disbelief and pure raw terror. As he tried to explain that the figure in the driveway wasn't just a killer, he told the dispatcher that the attacker was currently hunched over John Stevens, and he was biting him. When Officer Kimberly Binns drove her cruiser onto the lawn of 603 Kokomo Lane, the scene bathed in her headlights was a tableau of total madness. The air was thick with the smell of copper and the rhythmic, deep sounds of a predator at work. There, in the center of the driveway, was the 19-year-old Austin Haroof. He was shirtless, his strong frame glistening with sweat and a dark, slick layer of blood. He was positioned on top of John Stevens, his fingers dug deep into the older man's shoulders, and his head was down. He wasn't just attacking, he was systematically ripping at Stevens' face with his teeth, oblivious to the world around him. The officer didn't hesitate. She drew her taser, the red laser dot moving across Austin's back before she pulled the trigger. The click, click, click of the electrical current echoed through the night as the probes found their mark, but the expected collapse never happened. Austin didn't scream, he didn't even flinch. The 50,000 volts of electricity seemed to do nothing but irritate him, causing him to emit a low, vibrating growl that sounded more like a large dog than a human being. He remained locked onto his victim, his jaw clamped shut with a strength that suggested his muscles were being fueled by something far more potent than adrenaline. By the time backup arrived, the situation had spiraled into a tactical nightmare. 2 more deputies joined the struggle, grabbing Austin's arms and legs, but he possessed a frightening, superhuman strength. He tossed his body back and forth, dragging the officers across the pavement as they fought to break his grip. Every time they managed to pull him a few inches away, he would lunge back, snapping his teeth and trying to resume the meal he had started. The officers later remarked that his skin felt strangely cold to the touch, despite the oppressive Florida heat, and his eyes were rolled back, showing nothing but a terrifying, milky white. Desperate to save the man on the ground, the deputies released a K9 named Cito. The dog, trained to take down the most violent of suspects, sank its teeth into Austin's arm, shaking him with a force that should have ended any resistance. Yet, Austin barely reacted to the dog. He didn't cry out in pain, he simply continued his animalistic focus on John Stevens. It took a combined effort, multiple taser deployments, a K9 bite, and 4 grown men physically prying his fingers open to finally roll the teenager onto his back and secure the first set of handcuffs. Even as he was being subdued, the horror didn't stop. As they pulled him away, Austin began to spit out chunks of human flesh. He stared at the officers with a vacant, chilling intensity, his mouth a crimson mask of gore. As they loaded him into the back of a patrol car, he reportedly looked at one of the deputies and began to moan, telling them to help him because he had eaten something bad. When they asked what he had ingested, his answer was direct and devoid of emotion. He told them he had eaten humans. He told them he had eaten his last meal. While one team of officers struggled with Austin, others moved into the garage to attend to the victims. The silence inside was a heavy, suffocating blanket. They found Michelle Mishkan first. She was lying near the back of the garage, her life taken in a flurry of violence so intense it had left the room unrecognizable. The garage bar, once a symbol of community and light, was now a hollow, blood-stained shell. John Stevens lay in the driveway, the extent of his injuries so severe that the veteran deputies, men who had seen years of Florida's most brutal crimes, had to look away. Austin's behavior continued to fluctuate between animalistic rage and a disturbing, childlike state of confusion. He began to growl again, making nipping motions with his teeth at anyone who came near the cruiser. He told the paramedics that they could shoot him now because he deserved to die. He spoke about special powers, and the dark, his speech slurring as his body began to shut down from the physical toll of the struggle and whatever internal process was ravaging his organs. The transport to St. Mary's Medical Center was done under heavy guard. Austin was vomiting up the remains of his victims, his throat and esophagus already beginning to burn from a substance investigators hadn't yet identified. The neighborhood of Kokomo Lane, usually a sanctuary of quiet retirement, was now a brightly lit crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, cordoning off the garage bar forever. The palm trees stood as silent witnesses to the moment the suburban dream was devoured by a nightmare that had no name, no motive, and no mercy. The sirens had barely faded into the humid night before the cameras began to arrive, turning the quiet suburban streets of Jupiter into a stage for a global spectacle. As images of a blood-masked college student began to circulate, the world's collective imagination seized on a single terrifying explanation: synthetic drugs. The term flakka became a household word overnight, a shorthand for a specific kind of chemical madness that allegedly turned humans into flesh-eating monsters. Media outlets from London to Tokyo fixated on the zombie frat boy narrative, fueled by the visceral horror of the crime and Florida's reputation as a testing ground for the latest and most dangerous designer stimulants. Detectives from the Martin County Sheriff's Office were initially inclined to agree with the public's assessment. The raw, superhuman strength Austin had exhibited, the ability to ignore taser shocks, the resistance to a canine's bite, and the sheer animalistic focus on his victims aligned perfectly with the known effects of alpha PVP or bath salts. These drugs were notorious for causing excited delirium, a state of hyperarousal where the body's temperature skyrockets and the mind enters a loop of violent paranoia. The working theory was simple. Austin Harrouff had taken something, and that something had stripped away every layer of his humanity. However, the medical reality inside St. Mary's Medical Center was complicating this narrative. Austin wasn't just under arrest, he was dying. Within hours of his arrival, his internal organs began to fail. His liver and kidneys were shutting down, and his esophagus was severely burned, as if he had swallowed a caustic liquid. This led investigators back to the scene at Kokomo Lane, where they discovered several open containers of household chemicals in the Stevens garage, solvents and weed killers that Austin had apparently ingested during or after the attack. It wasn't clear if he had drunk them in a final act of self-destruction or if, in his delusional state, he believed they were part of the purity he so desperately sought. Because of the complexity of the case and the potential for rare synthetic compounds, the local toxicology labs were deemed insufficient. The FBI was called in and samples of Austin's blood were sent to a specialized facility in Virginia. For weeks, the investigation hung in a state of suspended animation. The families of John Stevens and Michelle Mishkan waited for a chemical smoking gun that would provide a motive for the inexplicable. They wanted to believe that a drug was responsible because the alternative, that a human mind could do this on its own, was far more difficult to process. When the toxicology report finally returned, it hit the sheriff's office like a physical blow. The results were clean. There was no flakka, there were no bath salts, there was only a trace amount of THC from marijuana, and a minimal, non-intoxicating level of alcohol. Austin Harrouff had committed a double homicide and an act of cannibalism while essentially sober. The zombie narrative collapsed, replaced by a much darker forensic reality. The monster wasn't a chemical, it was a clinical, catastrophic break from reality. Detectives shifted their focus to Austin's digital and personal life, searching for the origins of this madness. They spent hundreds of hours combing through his computer, his phone, and a series of journals he had kept in the months leading up to the attack. What they found was a map of a mind disintegrating in real time. The journals were a chaotic mix of fitness goals, philosophical ramblings, and disturbing admissions. He wrote about hearing voices that told him he was a god, an entity of ancient power who didn't belong in the modern world. He described a growing fear that he was becoming something else, something half human and half animal. One of the most chilling discoveries was his YouTube channel. In his final videos, a charismatic student athlete had been replaced by a man staring into the lens with hollowed eyes, speaking in riddles about balance and purity. He had become obsessed with the idea of being a protector, while simultaneously expressing a deep fear of the very people around him. There were searches on his computer for how to tell if you're going crazy in hallucinations, suggesting that Austin was aware of the rot inside his mind, but was too deep in the delusion to seek conventional help. The psychiatric evaluations that followed were equally disturbing. Multiple experts, including those hired by the prosecution, began to form a consensus. Austin wasn't just angry. He was suffering from a severe form of schizoaffective disorder and clinical lycanthropy, a rare psychiatric syndrome where a person believes they can transform into an animal. The doctors noted that his behavior on Kokomo Lane, the growling, the biting, the lack of response to pain, were textbook symptoms of a brain that had completely disconnected from human social norms. The prosecution tried to push back, pointing to the argument Austin had with his father at Duffy Sports Grill as a traditional motive of rage. They argued that he was a spoiled young man who had simply snapped after being embarrassed by his parents. They focused on the fact that he had carried a pocket knife, suggesting premeditation. But the sheer bizarreness of the crime scene and the total lack of a logical goal made the rage theory difficult to maintain. Why would a man seeking revenge stop to eat the face of a stranger? Why would he drink garden chemicals until his throat burned? As the investigation drew to a close, the community of Jupiter was left in a state of permanent unease. The Flacca myth had provided a comfortable shield, a way to blame a suburban tragedy on an urban drug epidemic. Without it, the residents were forced to confront a more unsettling truth. They looked at their own children, their own high-achieving golden boys, and wondered what might be lurking behind a 3.3 GPA and a gym-sculpted physique. The investigation had solved the how and the what, but the why remained a jagged open wound that no forensic report could ever truly close. The legal battle dragged on for 6 years, a grueling marathon of psychiatric evaluations and procedural delays that tested the patience of a grieving community. In November 2022, the case finally reached its climax in a Martin County courtroom. However, there was no jury to weigh the evidence. Both the prosecution and the defense agreed to a bench trial, ultimately conceding to a startling conclusion. Austin Harrouff was legally insane at the time of the murders. Circuit Judge Sherwood Bauer accepted the plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, a verdict that sent a wave of silent, painful fury through the gallery where the Mishkan and Stevens families sat. Instead of a prison cell, Austin was sentenced to indefinite commitment in a secure state mental health facility. During the victim impact statements, the families were given a final chance to speak. They described the vibrant lives he had extinguished, lives that would never be restored by a clinical diagnosis or a court order. Today, the garage bar on Kokomo Lane is gone, replaced by a heavy silence that no warm tropical breeze can ever truly fill. The Harrouff case remains a grim, indelible milestone in forensic history, a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not born of synthetic chemicals or urban legends, but of the raw, untethered human mind. Austin now exists in a state-run shadow, while the community of Jupiter carries a permanent scar. In the end, we are left to wonder how thin the line truly is between the golden life we build and the sudden darkness we can never fully predict. Some secrets remain buried in the Florida soil, proving that madness has no logic and peace is only as strong as the mind that guards it. Tina Heins was born on February 27, 1974 in Wisconsin. After finishing school, she met a man named Jeremy, and when Tina was 19, the two of them got married. Jeremy joined the Navy, and that decision effectively set the direction of their entire life. They had to move away, ending up in Florida in a suburb outside Jacksonville. Around that same time, Tina found out she was pregnant. They were expecting their first child, and everything suddenly felt very adult very fast. Jeremy spent most of his time in the military base near the city, while Tina worked at a restaurant. But she was also trying to plan ahead. Tina had applied to a university back in Wisconsin, and she was hoping that as soon as Jeremy could transfer out of Florida to another state, she'd be able to go back and continue her education. By April of 1994, Tina was 20 years old. They were still living in a small apartment complex not far from the base. Tina was 15 weeks pregnant at that point, and she was still working her restaurant job like usual. Around the same time, Jeremy's younger brother Chad came to stay with him. He was 19 and he had plans to settle in Florida, but at first, he just couldn't afford his own place. He was waiting for his fiancée to come down with her child, and until that happened, Jeremy told him he could stay at their apartment. There wasn't an extra bedroom, so Chad slept on the couch in the living room. And as a way to say thank you, because they really were helping him out, he tried to make himself useful. Tina was in her 4th month of pregnancy. She was still working and it was a lot to handle on her own, so Chad helped her out with chores around the apartment whenever he could. That all continued until April 16th. Tina had to work that day, and Jeremy had been on base for a few days already. The night rolled on like normal, quiet, uneventful, the kind of night you wouldn't remember until 5:45 the next morning when Chad called the police. He said he needed help and added there had been a murder. Officers rushed to the apartment, and inside they found Tina in her bedroom. She was lying on the bed with a pillowcase over her head, and it was immediately obvious she'd been stabbed multiple times. Her clothes were missing from the waist down, which made police believe she'd been sexually assaulted. Chad told them that the night before he'd gone out drinking and got back home around 12:30 a.m., then fell asleep on the couch in the living room. About 2 hours later, he heard Tina come in from her late shift at the restaurant, but he said he stayed asleep. Then, at around 5:45 in the morning, he woke up to the sound of the fire alarm and the smell of smoke. When he opened his eyes, part of the couch he'd been sleeping on was on fire, and then he noticed there were 3 other small fires, one in the living room and others in the kitchen. Chad said he put the fires out, then went to Tina's bedroom to check on her, and that's when he found her. He also said that when he woke up, the front door was wide open, and after he discovered Tina's body, he ran to the neighbors and called police from their phone. Medical examiners determined that Tina had been stabbed at least 27 times, and they also confirmed she'd been sexually assaulted. On top of that, she clearly tried to fight back. There were scratches and abrasions all over her hands and arms. Detectives collected every knife in the apartment, but none of them matched the murder weapon. While the crime scene team kept searching for anything else, investigators sat down with Chad, and almost immediately, he started setting off alarm bells. They couldn't understand how he could have been asleep just a few feet from Tina's bedroom and not woken up. Based on his story and what the scene suggested, some unknown attacker would have had to get inside, assault Tina, stab her dozens of times, and then start fires in 4 different spots around the apartment, including the couch Chad was sleeping on. And through all of that, he supposedly slept right through it. The only thing he claimed he noticed was Tina coming home from work, when he said he briefly woke up for a second. Suspicion got even stronger when police pulled Chad's record. He'd been arrested more than once, including an incident where a 17-year-old girl got pregnant from him. He was 18 at the time, and she said it had been consensual, so the charges were dropped after she married him. But Chad still had other run-ins with the law for theft and smaller offenses, so detectives started leaning hard toward one theory. Chad did it. In their minds, he may have been fixated on Tina for a long time, and that night he finally snapped. Then, after the fact, he set multiple fires to destroy evidence, and tossed in the front door was open detail to make it sound like some outside intruder. With all of that on the table, police arrested Chad and charged him with Tina's murder. He was held in jail while he awaited for trial, and he stuck to his original story, repeating that he had nothing to do with it. Not long after, he hired an attorney, and that's when the defense started digging for anything that could back up Chad's claim that he was innocent. The first thing Chad's attorney pointed out was this. There wasn't a single drop of blood on Chad's clothes, and there were no bruises or scratches on his body. Nothing you'd expect if Tina had been fighting for her life and trying to claw her attacker off. Prosecutors fired back with their own explanation. They said Chad could have taken off the bloody clothes afterward, carried them out of the apartment along with the murder weapon, then washed himself off in the shower. They also noted that Chad had a burn on his hand, consistent with the kind of injury you could get from holding a lighter on too long. Then the defense brought up something else. The forensic team had found multiple biological samples at the scene. Under Tina's fingernails, there were skin particles, and on the bedsheet, there were traces of male semen. But at the time, DNA testing was still pretty new in courtrooms, and it wasn't anywhere near as precise as it is today. So for a jury back then, it didn't carry the same weight, and experts couldn't say with certainty this is a match or this is not. On top of that, investigators found 3 stray hairs on Tina's body and clothing. Testing suggested all 3 came from the same person, and it wasn't Chad. Still, that evidence basically went nowhere because the analyst who examined the hairs couldn't provide an official conclusion about how common that hair profile might be in the general population. The DNA tools they had at the time just didn't allow him to calculate those odds. The prosecution, meanwhile, pointed to something Chad allegedly said early on when he first saw his brother after everything happened. Chad broke down crying and reportedly said, "I'm sorry, I didn't want to do this." Jeremy also told his mother he believed Chad was responsible, even though he never publicly accused him of killing Tina. Chad, on the other hand, claimed he thought Jeremy could have done it. According to him, Jeremy and Tina fought constantly, and the marriage had been tense for a long time. But Jeremy had an airtight alibi. He was on a naval ship, and there was no way he could have physically pulled this off himself. The only scenario where he'd be involved would be if he'd asked someone else to do it, and investigators found nothing that supported that. So officially, Tina's husband wasn't treated as a suspect. And then there was the question police couldn't get past from day one. How did Chad sleep through all of this? His lawyer said Chad had a sleep disorder that made him extremely difficult to wake up, especially if he'd been drinking. And finally, the defense added one more detail. Jeremy and Tina kept a spare key outside near the front porch, and pretty much everyone close to them knew it was there. So if someone wanted to get inside, they wouldn't have had to force their way in at all. The trial didn't start until late 1996, more than 2 years after the murder, and by then, prosecutors said they had one more major piece that tied Chad to Tina's death. Chad had been sitting in jail that entire time, and 2 of his cellmates came forward claiming the same thing. Chad had openly confessed to him that he'd killed Tina. Both men took the stand and repeated that story in court. Combined with the rest of the prosecution's case, it was enough to sway the jury. At the end, Chad was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, so officially, Tina's murder was solved. But Chad never stopped insisting he was innocent. 5 years after the conviction, he reached out to an organization that works on wrongful conviction cases, and they took a serious interest in his file. Once they learned that investigators had recovered skin cells from under Tina's nails and semen from the bed sheets, the organization working closely with Chad's attorney filed an appeal asking for the DNA evidence to be retested. By that point, genetic testing had come a long way, and in 2005, experts came back with a result that changed everything. The skin under Tina's nails, the semen on the sheets, and the 3 hairs found on her body all belonged to the same man. But that man wasn't Chad. He wasn't Jeremy either. His DNA wasn't in the FBI database, so they still didn't have a name. But for the defense, this was the first real hope Chad could actually be cleared. Then they uncovered another detail that could have shifted the entire case years earlier. Crime scene techs had found a bloody fingerprint near the sink in Tina's apartment, exactly the kind of place you'd expect the killer to go if he was trying to wash blood off his hands. That print didn't belong to Chad, and it didn't match anyone else connected to the case. Yet, for some reason, it had never been brought up at trial. Not once. And there was one more unsettling fact. Another inmate, someone who'd been locked up in the same facility as Chad, later claimed he'd overheard 2 prisoners talking about how they were going to set Chad up. According to him, they were literally discussing how to say Chad had confessed to them. Even with all of that on the table, the DA's office tried to block the case from being reopened. They kept insisting Chad was guilty, but his attorneys finally got a breakthrough based on everything that had come out. The judge overturned Chad's conviction. The problem was the prosecution immediately announced they were going to try him again. So Chad didn't walk out of jail. It took about a year to gear up for a new trial. But eventually, prosecutors had to admit the obvious. With all the evidence now in front of them, Chad being the killer just didn't look likely anymore. In 2007, they dropped the plan for a second trial, and Chad was finally released after spending 13 years behind bars. So the case landed right back on detectives' desks. But the reopened investigation hit a wall almost immediately. The killer's DNA still wasn't in the database, and neither were his fingerprints. So the trail went cold all over again. That's basically where it stayed until 2017, when the local police department created a cold case unit. They picked Tina's case back up. But even 23 years after the murder, the killer's DNA still wasn't showing up in any database. In 2021, investigators decided to try something new: forensic genetic genealogy. They brought the DNA to a company called Aram, and the lab started building out a family tree for the unknown suspect, tracking down relatives through public genetic databases. It definitely wasn't quick, The whole process stretched out over 4 years, and it wasn't until September 2025 that finally narrowed it down to one specific family. People who lived nearby in the same city back in the 90s. From there, detectives zeroed in on one person who fit the profile best. Next, they went to one of his close relatives and asked for a DNA sample to compare. The results came back showing a very close biological link to the killer's DNA, and that led them straight to a 51-year-old man named Michael Ziegler. At first, this name didn't ring any bells. But when detectives started digging into who Michael actually was, they hit a detail that stopped them cold. Michael wasn't some random stranger. He was actually one of Jeremy's closest friends. They'd served together in the Navy, so they were basically brothers in arms. Michael had even stood up in Jeremy and Tina's wedding as a groomsman just 5 months before Tina was murdered. By 2025, 31 years after the crime, Michael was retired and living in Georgia with his mother. He didn't have a serious criminal record, and as far as anyone could tell, he'd never even been in any legal trouble. And what's wild is that throughout the entire investigation, his name never came up. Not once. Even Jeremy had never suspected him because nothing at any point seemed to point in that direction. To Jeremy, Michael stayed exactly what he'd always been, a friend and a fellow sailor. Until over time, they just drifted out of each other's lives. Once police finally had a solid name to work with, they reached out to authorities in Georgia. Local officers moved in and arrested Michael. After that, investigators collected his DNA, and the results came back as a full match. The semen, the skin found under Tina's nails, and the 3 unknown hairs all belonged to him. With that, Michael was charged with murder and sexual assault, and he was extradited back to Florida. He's now sitting in jail waiting for trial. And as of this moment, a court date still hasn't been set. At his first hearing, he pleaded not guilty. But with the kind of evidence stacked against him, it's hard to see how he avoids conviction. And because this happened in Florida, he could be facing the death penalty. So, prosecutors might eventually offer him a deal, life in prison, in exchange for a guilty plea, taking the death penalty off the table. As for Chad, once he was released, he went straight back to Wisconsin to be with his family. And after losing 13 years of his life, he didn't get a single dollar in compensation. The reason comes down to Florida law. If someone has prior convictions, even for minor offenses, they can be disqualified from getting wrongful conviction compensation. And Chad had those earlier charges on his record. Still, he says he's just grateful the truth finally came out, even if it took an absurdly long time. Right now, there's also no public information on whether Chad tried to go after the police or prosecutors who built the case against him. And it's hard not to wonder about that bloody fingerprint found near the sink, not belonging to Chad, and somehow never brought up in trial. That detail alone could have changed everything. Whether it was an oversight or something more, we may never know. But it seems like Chad chose not to spend the rest of his life trapped in years of lawsuits. And one last thing, after Tina's murder, her parents set up a scholarship for low-income kids, covering tuition at the Catholic school Tina attended. That scholarship still exists today, and her family continues holding events to keep it funded. On January 7, 2020, in Toronto, Ontario Superior Court Justice Faye McCowan sentenced Philip Grandine to 15 years in prison for the manslaughter of his pregnant wife, Carissa Grandine. The former pastor who had once guided a congregation, preached about faith, covenant, and the sanctity of marriage, showed almost no reaction as the sentence was read aloud. It was the second time a jury had convicted him of the same crime. Outside the courtroom, Cliff McDowell, the pastor who had once sought to help his marriage survive, spoke to reporters.
It's a sad day for the family today. So there's no closure today. There's no rest for the family today. And this monster gets to play the system again.
This story began on the night of October 17, 2011, in a bungalow in Scarborough, Ontario, when a 29-year-old pregnant woman drowned in her own bathtub while her husband told police he had been out for a run. And as investigators dug deeper, they began to suspect this was no accident. Carissa Darwin was born on November 10, 1981, in Pasay City, in the Philippines. The eldest daughter of Ramon and Maria Chirito Darwin. She went by Carissa. She was 13 years old when her family moved to Toronto in 1994. Carissa was the type of person who carried hardship quietly so that other people didn't have to bear it. She had battled a long-term liver illness for years and seldom mentioned it. She worked extra jobs alongside her studies, alongside everything else, because she was determined to earn a double degree from the University of Toronto. She graduated in 2006 with an honors Bachelor of Science in Human Biology and Archaeology. Two disciplines, one woman who wanted to understand how living things functioned and how the past shaped the present. After graduating, she built a career in downtown Toronto as a casualty underwriter for Berkeley, Canada. Precise work, analytical work, the type of role that required the same careful, methodical intelligence she applied to everything she touched. Her faith was the other axis of her life. She was a member of Jarvis Street Baptist Church, and that community was not peripheral to who she was. It was central. She served, she appeared, she gave what she had. People who loved her called her a true example of a saint, not as a figure of speech, as a description. She had, over the course of her marriage, discovered that her husband was having an affair with a woman from their congregation, a woman who was also her friend, and Carissa had forgiven the woman, because that was the type of person she was. Carissa had a forgiving heart. On October 11th, 2008, Carissa married Philip Grandine at Jarvis Street Baptist Church. Philip was 22 years old. He was at that point the pastor of Eglinton Baptist Church near Eglinton Avenue and Dufferin Streets. Young, trusted, publicly faithful. By 2011, the couple were expecting their first child. Carissa was 20 weeks pregnant. She had nicknamed the baby Jelly Bean. She was cautious throughout the pregnancy. She had been prescribed an anti-nausea medication, but disliked taking it. It made her too drowsy, and she didn't want to feel that way while she was carrying her baby. She would not take anything she hadn't been prescribed. The health of Jelly Bean came first. It always did. In the first days of October 2011, Carissa attended a marriage counseling session and confronted Philip directly about the affair she suspected he had quietly renewed. He denied it. She pressed him. He denied it again. 3 days later, on October 14th, she became suddenly and inexplicably ill. Dizziness, disorientation, impaired muscle control, sedation. Symptoms she could not explain. Philip drove her to St. Michael's Hospital. She was examined and tested. Her symptoms faded. She was released. 3 days after that, on the night of October 17th, Philip Grandine called 911 to report that he had returned home from a jog and found his wife unresponsive in the bathtub.
Toronto Ambulance, where do you need us?
12 Marsh Road.
Okay, so tell me exactly what's happened.
I just came home, and I was out running, and my wife was taking a bath, and when I came home, she's in the bath, but she's under the water, and she's not breathing.
Okay, sir, did you remove the water from the bathtub?
No, I haven't.
Okay, take the moment to do that now, okay?
Okay.
Okay, how old is she, sir?
She's 29.
She's 29? Okay, is she breathing at all?
No, I don't think so.
Are you able to get her out of the bathtub?
I probably can. Do you want me to do that now?
Yes, I want you to do that now. Get her out, put her on the floor, flat on her back, okay?
I know how to do CPR.
Okay, well, I'm going to guide you through that. Do that right now. Get her out, put her flat on her back. What's your name?
Philip.
Philip?
Yeah.
Okay, Philip, we have plenty of help coming. We have police, fire, and ambulance driving there as fast as we can, okay?
Carissa ended up in the hospital, but by the time she got there, it was too late. She was already gone. She drowned. She was 29, 20 weeks pregnant. In those last moments, she was trapped in that same confused haze she'd struggled with just days before at the hospital. She stepped into the bath, and somehow she never made it out. Philip Grandine's account to police was straightforward. He had gone for a run. He came home. He found Carissa underwater in the bathtub. He tried to lift her out and failed. He called for help.
So then you leave at 9:45?
I left. She was in the washroom. I came home an hour later, went down the hallway to the washroom to use the washroom, and just to pee, and then I knocked on the door, and I know she's still in there because the door is closed, the light is on, you can see the light under the door, and I said, I have to use the washroom. I would normally never go in there to do that if I know she's in there. I would let her have a chance maybe to pull the shower curtain closed or something like that, but she didn't answer me, so I just opened the door, and that's when I saw that she was in the tub, and then I went to the phone and I called 911.
The account was simple. The evidence was not. An autopsy confirmed Carissa had drowned. It also found something else, a bump on her head consistent with the time of her death, though not in itself fatal. Investigators noted it. They moved on. And then the toxicology results arrived. Carissa Grandine had lorazepam in her blood. Lorazepam, the drug sold under the brand name Ativan, is a controlled sedative used to treat anxiety. It causes drowsiness, disorientation, reduced muscle control, and impaired memory. It is not a drug anyone takes casually. It is not a drug prescribed to pregnant women, and it is absolutely not a drug that had ever been prescribed to Anna Carissa Grandine. Not once, not by any doctor for any reason. She was 20 weeks pregnant. She wouldn't take a mild anti-nausea medication because it made her sleepy, and she had a powerful sedative in her blood. How does a woman who won't even take her prescribed medication end up with a controlled sedative in her system? How does that happen? Investigators shifted their attention to Philip. They found out he had recently been compelled to leave his position as pastor at Innerdale Road Baptist Church. The reason was an affair with a woman from his congregation, a woman who was also Carissa's friend. The whole congregation had been informed about it. The marriage had fallen apart very publicly within the exact community that had watched them get married. Another pastor, Stephen Hadfield, had stepped in to offer marriage counseling only on the condition that Philip ended the affair, then stopped looking at pornography, which had become a serious ongoing issue. Philip agreed to both. Anna installed a program on their shared home computer to block those kinds of websites. On paper, they were trying to repair things. Philip had resumed the affair almost immediately. After leaving the church, he had taken a position as a nurse manager at a seniors' care facility in Toronto. His duties were specific. He distributed medication to residents. He disposed of the surplus. Among the medications that passed through his hands daily, lorazepam. Investigators examined the couple's shared computer. What they found was a history of searches for what lorazepam was, for what it did, for what dose would be considered fatal. Those searches, the Crown would argue, had been made by Philip. They appeared in proximity to other searches for escort services, for sexual content that Carissa had no known reason to conduct. They examined the timeline of October 17th more closely. Philip had said he was jogging. Phone records and digital evidence told a different story. The judge, who later examined all the material, found that Philip had in fact been at home during that period. He had been on the phone with his mistress, and he had obtained a temporary password used in the minutes before he called 911 to uninstall the pornography blocking program from the computer. The program was removed while Carissa was in the bathtub. Then, investigators did something that reframed everything. They went back and tested the blood samples taken from Carissa at the hospital on October 14th, the visit 3 days before her death, when she had presented with sudden dizziness and disorientation and symptoms she couldn't explain. Those samples also contained lorazepam. This is the part that is genuinely hard to get your head around. Justice McQuat later found that October 14th was not a one-off. It was a trial run. The judge ruled that Philip had given lorazepam to both himself and Carissa on that day on purpose to see how the drug worked, to understand the dose, to watch how she reacted. He wanted to know what would happen before he tried it again. The symptoms on that day were stronger than he had apparently expected. Strong enough that he had to drive her to hospital, and it still didn't stop him. He just adjusted. 3 days later, he tried again. That is not someone who lost control in a moment of crisis. That is someone who ran a deliberate test on his pregnant wife and then used what he learned. Philip Grandine was charged with first-degree murder in May 2012. The first trial was held in 2014. The charge was first-degree murder. After hearing the evidence, the jury did not convict Philip of murder. They convicted him of manslaughter. Justice Robert Clark sentenced him to 15 years in prison. Philip's legal team filed an appeal. In September 2017, Ontario's Court of Appeal granted it. The original trial judge had made a legal error. During deliberations, the jury had sent a question to the bench, and in answering, Justice Clark had introduced a theory of liability that had not been argued during the trial itself. The appeal court found this had undermined the fairness of the verdict. A new trial was ordered, but only on the manslaughter charge. Because the Crown had not cross-appealed the acquittal on the murder count, prosecutors in the second trial were prohibited from arguing Philip had intended to kill his wife. That restriction matters more than it might seem. In the second trial, the Crown couldn't use the word intention. They couldn't put it to the jury that Philip Grandine meant to kill his wife. All they could argue was that he drugged her, which was a criminal act, and that the drugging led to her death, even if killing her wasn't the stated goal. That is a much narrower argument than murder. And yet the judge's own words at sentencing were hostile, animus, diabolical, and violent, planned and premeditated, closer to almost murder. Those are not the words a judge uses in a routine manslaughter case. They are the words a judge uses when the legal box available to her is too small for what the evidence actually showed. The 15-year sentence, the most the Crown asked for, the same as the first trial, reflects the gap between what the law could call it and what Justice McLeod clearly believed it was. The second trial began in early 2019 before Justice Faye McLeod. Crown Attorney Donna Kelway built the case from the ground up. The access to lorazepam through Philip's workplace, the computer searches for dosage and effects, the pornography blocking program uninstalled while Carissa was in the bathtub, the phone call to his mistress on the night she drowned, the alibi that the digital record disputed, the lorazepam found in Carissa's blood not once but twice, 3 days apart. Kelway addressed the jury plainly. Carissa Grandine died because she had been unknowingly sedated. She was drugged without her knowledge or permission. She was drugged against her will, and in that sedated state, she drowned in the bathtub. Even though Philip Grandine didn't intend her death, he was nonetheless responsible for her death. The defense said Carissa took the drug on her own, driven by depression after finding out about her husband's affair. They argued she either drowned by accident or took her own life. Emmett Thakor, Philip's lawyer, pointed out that no one ever saw Philip with the medication. No drugs were reported missing from the nursing home. In short, they pinned it on Carissa. Philip Grandine never testified. Not at the first trial, not at the second. Through all the years, he never took the stand to explain himself or answer questions under oath. 2 trials, all that time he stayed silent. That speaks volumes, doesn't it? The jury came back after just a day or so, February 28, 2019. They found him guilty of manslaughter. Philip barely reacted, just stared straight ahead as the verdict was read. Later that year in November, Justice McWatt delivered her findings. She didn't buy the defense's story at all. No sign Carissa was depressed. No evidence she had lorazepam, nothing to suggest she'd risk her 20-week pregnancy by taking something so dangerous, especially not with a baby she called Jelly Bean. The judge said Philip was the one who looked up the drug, stole it, and gave it to his wife, not just once, but twice. A test run on October 14th, and again the night she died. She called out Philip's resentment toward Carissa. She saw he was tangled in his affair and obsessed with pornography. Whenever Carissa was knocked out, he could go after those things undisturbed. And that night Carissa drowned, Philip wasn't out jogging. He was home, on the phone with his mistress, removing the internet filter Carissa added in a last effort to save their marriage. On January 7, 2020, the judge handed down 15 years. She said his actions were closer to murder than any manslaughter she had ever seen. He appealed again. But in May 2022, the Ontario Court of Appeal shut everything down. They didn't agree with a single point. Guilty verdict stands. Sentence stands. 15 years. And that was that. Philip Grandine was out of options. But all those hearings, all those appeals, what did they cost Carissa's family? Her mother, Maria Chirito, her father, Ramon, her sister, Hannah. No court record tells you that. There's just Maria Chirito's voice at the sentencing hearing. She forgave Philip because she's Christian, but she couldn't accept what happened. She said her daughter was crying out for justice from her grave. She said that 8 years after Carissa died, 8 years of legal back and forth, 8 years with Philip out on bail, more than 6 of them living his life while the Darvin family sat through every court date, waiting. The justice system finally worked. The sentence stayed in place. But the price those people paid, coming back, hearing verdict after verdict, sitting across from him, no document will ever capture that grief. There's one detail buried in the court record that people tend to miss. It's not about drug tests or computers or legal arguments. It's this. When Carissa got sick on October 14th, suddenly dizzy and confused, she turned to her husband and asked him a question. She asked Philip if he'd given her a pill. He told her no. She was already disoriented. The drug was working on her mind and body. She didn't know what was happening, but even then, something inside her reached for an answer. She asked the man who'd done it point blank if he was responsible. He looked at her and lied. 3 days later, she was dead. She was just 29. No sentence. 15 years, 50 years, any number at all can measure the weight of that loss. On July 27, 2004, 16 days after 16-year-old Britney Gregory vanished from her father's home in Brick Township, New Jersey, a search team followed bloodhounds into a wooded corridor off Ridge Avenue in Lakewood. And there, in a shallow grave barely 2 feet deep, they found her. What investigators would eventually learn was that Britney had not been taken by a stranger in the night. She had accepted a ride from a man she believed she could trust, and that decision made in a moment of impatience driven by the ordinary desire of a teenage girl to see her boyfriend would cost her everything. Britney Gregory was born into a family that, like many families, had its complications. Her parents, Deborah Gregory and Joseph Dunn, did not live together. Her mother, Deborah, made her home in Beechwood, a small borough in Ocean County. Her father, Joseph Dunn, lived on Greenwood Loop Road in Brick Township, a modest community along the Jersey Shore, about 60 miles south of New York City. Britney had grown up between the two households, and by the time she was a teenager, she was living primarily with her father in Brick. She had a sister named Bobby Jo Dunn, who was 19 at the time of Britney's death. Her other siblings included Brianna Gregory, Brian Gregory, and a brother who went by the nickname Boomer, William Gregory. She was the youngest among them, and by all accounts, she carried that position with grace rather than expectation. Britney had attended elementary and middle school in Toms River before transferring to Brick Township Memorial High School at the start of 9th grade. The move suited her. She was the kind of student teachers remembered, not because she was disruptive or difficult, but because she was genuinely engaged. She earned straight A's. She loved science, and she had already set her sights on a future career as a forensic scientist, a goal that, given everything that would follow, carries a particular and heartbreaking weight. Her classmates at Brick Memorial described her in terms that went beyond academic achievement. John Barrett, a 16-year-old who knew her from school, would later say simply, "She made everything nicer." It was not an elaborate tribute, but it was an honest one. She had a warmth to her, a quality that made the people around her feel better for her presence. Darlene Andamasaurus, whose son attended Brick Memorial with Britney, described her as someone who consistently put others ahead of herself. Britney was not your typical teenager, and Andamasaurus told reporters she always put other people ahead of herself. She was very kind and wonderful. Her mother, Deborah Gregory, spoke of her daughter in terms that made clear just how central Britney was to her life. "She's the 16-year-old kid everybody wants." Deborah said, "She was my prize. It was like she was plucked right out of heaven." Britney had blue eyes and long blonde hair. In photographs taken throughout her life, the expression she wore most often was a smile. Not the posed, constructed kind, but the kind that seemed to come easily naturally, as though the false setting of her face was joy. By July 2004, she had just completed her sophomore year. She was 16 years old, doing well in school, and she had a boyfriend she was eager to see. It was a Sunday evening. It was summer. It should have been unremarkable. At approximately 8:30 in the evening on Sunday, July 11, 2004, Britney Gregory picked up a phone and called her mother. She was calling from her father's house on Greenwood Loop Road in Brick. Joseph Dunn was not home at the time. His girlfriend had not yet returned for the evening either, leaving Britney alone in the house. She wanted a ride to her boyfriend's house, and she was asking her mother to arrange one. Deborah Gregory told her daughter she could not immediately come herself, but that Britney's sister could give her a ride if she was willing to wait about 45 minutes. It was a small ask. 45 minutes. Britney said she understood, but Britney was 16 and she was impatient. 45 minutes felt like a long time when all she wanted was to be somewhere else. Around that same time, a man named Jack Fuller Jr. arrived at the Greenwood Loop Roadhouse looking for Joseph Dunn. Fuller was 38 years old. He lived on Western Drive in the Ramtown section of Howell Township, about a mile and a half away. He and Dunn had known each other for years. Fuller's daughter, Cassandra, was close friends with Britney's sister, Bobby Jo. In the world that Britney occupied, the network of fathers and friends and neighbors that constituted life in that corner of Ocean County, Fuller was a familiar face, not a stranger, someone her family knew. Fuller found that Dunn was not home. Britney was there alone, and when the conversation turned to her needing a ride, Fuller offered to take her. She accepted. It was the last decision Britney Gregory would ever make. When her father's girlfriend returned to the house later that night, Britney was not there. When her mother tried calling back later in the evening, there was no answer. By morning, the family knew something was wrong. Britney Gregory was reported missing. What followed was one of the most extensive missing person searches in the recent history of Ocean County, New Jersey. Brick Township Police, alongside officers from throughout Ocean and Monmouth counties, began combing the area almost immediately. Police helicopters swept over heavily wooded and swampy terrain. Bloodhounds were brought in. Volunteers joined professional search teams. At the peak of the effort, hundreds of law enforcement officers were involved, many of them donating their own time beyond their regular shifts for the community of Brick Township, which had long prided itself on its safety. It had been cited as the second safest city in the country. The disappearance of a 16-year-old girl was deeply destabilizing. Residents posted flyers bearing Britney's image throughout the area. Her description was submitted to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Her face appeared regularly on television news programs across the metropolitan region. On July 18th, exactly 1 week after Britney was last seen, Ocean County authorities arrested Jack Fuller Jr. and charged him with murder. The arrest came before her body had been found, an unusual step that reflected the strength of the evidence investigators had already assembled. Fuller was booked into the Ocean County Jail on $1 million bail. He had initially denied any involvement in Britney's disappearance. But investigators had more than they were revealing. A police informant had made a secret audio tape in which Fuller was recorded asking whether burying someone 4 feet underground was deep enough to protect a body from animals. On the same recording, Fuller referenced Thomas Long, a longtime friend also from Howell Township, in a way that suggested Long needed to be silenced because he had last seen Britney alive and in Fuller's car. Thomas Long was 39 years old. He confirmed to investigators that on the evening of July 11th, he had been with Fuller, and that Fuller had given him a ride home to Howell before Britney moved from the back seat to the front. Long described the brief moment he had observed between them, noting that Britney had not engaged with him at all, that she had been focused entirely on Fuller. He told investigators he was cooperating fully. On July 19th, Fuller appeared in court before State Superior Court Judge James Sida, wearing a red jail jumpsuit, his eyes avoiding the packed courtroom gallery filled with Britney's family members and friends. Deborah Gregory was in that courtroom. She had spent the prior days driving streets around Brick and Howell, searching for any trace of her daughter. On the morning of Fuller's court appearance, before his arrest, he had ridden in the back seat of her car and offered her a hug. She would later recall that embrace with visceral revulsion. "He gave me a hug and I just felt cold," she told reporters. "Like, you don't mean this. If I had known then, he wouldn't have made it to the courthouse." Standing on the courthouse steps, Deborah was direct. "She was just a good kid," she said. "I want her back. I want her back. Just give her to me." Inside, she positioned herself at the end of a third-row bench and told family members she needed to see his face. "I want to look right in that man's face," she said. "I want him to see me." On July 25th, 2 weeks to the hour after Britney's disappearance, several hundred people gathered at Windward Beach Park in Brick Township for a twilight prayer vigil. Estimates placed attendance as high as 2,000. Classmates wore shirts bearing Britney's photograph. Her sister Brianna read a poem written in Britney's voice describing her passage into death. Sobs moved through the crowd as she read. Brick Township Mayor Joseph F. Scarpelli called it the worst tragedy the town had ever seen. 2 days later, on July 27, 2004, the Bloodhound teams found her. Britney's body was recovered from a shallow grave beneath a power line off Ridge Avenue in Lakewood, approximately 1.5 miles from Fuller's home, and not far from where she had lived with her father in Brick. She had been buried without clothing. An autopsy conducted by Dr. Hideout Park confirmed blunt trauma to Britney's head. However, 16 days of summer decomposition had progressed to the point where a definitive cause of death could not be established. Dr. Park could not rule out asphyxiation or suffocation as contributing or primary factors. The head injuries alone were not determined to be fatal. Whatever had killed Britney had happened inside that car. Blood recovered from Jack Fuller's vehicle was subsequently confirmed through forensic analysis to belong to Britney Gregory. Her private funeral was held on August 2, 2004 in Brick Township. An impromptu memorial grew near the school. Online condolences came in from strangers who had seen her photograph on the news and found themselves undone by her smile. All around the funeral home were photographs of Britney captured in moments of ordinary life, moments that now felt unbearably precious. To understand what happened to Britney Gregory, it is necessary to understand who Jack Fuller Jr. was, not as a monster in the abstract, but as a specific person with a specific history that had been visible for years. Fuller had an extensive criminal record. In May and August of 2000, he had been sentenced to 5 years in prison on 2 separate theft cases in Ocean and Monmouth counties. Those sentences ran concurrently, and he was released in 2002. In the 2 years between that release and Britney's murder, he had been returned to custody for 3 months on a probation violation, had pleaded guilty to assault, and had been indicted on a drug charge. He was most recently released from prison in April 2003, just 15 months before the night he offered Britney a ride. Neighbors and acquaintances described Fuller to reporters as a temperamental man with a known addiction to crack cocaine. He lived with his father. His daughter Cassandra's friendship with Bobby Joe Dunn had inserted him into the peripheral orbit of the Gregory Dunn family. Not close, but familiar known. After his arrest, Fuller maintained his innocence for over a year. He pleaded not guilty. His defense attorney, John Goins, filed motions to suppress evidence, to change venue, and to dismiss the indictment on the basis that no cause of death had been definitively established. Ocean County Executive Assistant Prosecutor Ronald F. Diggy countered each of them, maintaining the state had ample evidence and that the decomposed state of the body, the very result of Fuller's own actions, was the reason cause of death could not be precisely identified. By July 2005, the one-year anniversary of Britney's disappearance, the family was still waiting for a trial. Joseph Dunn told reporters he missed her every single day. Her brother William offered a more conflicted reflection, one marked by regret as much as grief. "I miss this kid every day," he said. He described realizing too late how little time he had invested in his family. "I was never there when I was supposed to be," he said. "I feel like I have failed as a brother." On October 18, 2005, 1 week before his trial was scheduled to begin in Toms River, Jack Fuller Jr. entered a courtroom and stood before Superior Court Judge Vincent J. Grasso. He pleaded guilty to a single count of murder. What came next was one of the most chilling judicial confessions in Ocean County's modern history. Responding to questions from his own attorney, John Goins, Fuller described the events of July 11, 2004, in methodical, emotionless detail. After dropping off Thomas Long at his home in Howell, Britney moved from the back seat to the front seat of Fuller's car. Shortly afterward, Fuller stopped the vehicle and produced a crack pipe. Britney, a 16-year-old girl who had been raised to have standards, reacted as any decent person might. She raised her hand toward the pipe, raised her voice, and demanded that he stop. She told him she did not want him smoking crack cocaine in front of her. Fuller's response was to punch her in the head at least twice. He admitted this without hesitation in open court. When Goins asked whether he had struck her with the intent to incapacitate her, Fuller responded, "I did." Britney began to bleed profusely from her nose and mouth. She lost consciousness. According to Fuller's own account, she began making gurgling sounds, the sound produced when blood or fluid enters the airway of an unconscious person. Her head slumped to one side, and Jack Fuller continued to smoke his cocaine. He did not call for help. He did not attempt to revive her. He did not stop. Only after he had finished getting high did he turn to check on the girl sitting next to him. By then, she was no longer breathing. The courtroom was not prepared for the specificity of what Fuller revealed. Joseph Dunn stormed out of the room when Fuller acknowledged hearing the gurgling sound and doing nothing. Outside the courtroom, one of Britney's sisters collapsed and required medical attention. Others sat weeping quietly, absorbing words that had been held in silence for more than a year. Fuller kept his account confined to what he had to disclose. He offered no explanation for why Britney was buried without clothing. He said nothing about the specific sequence of events between her death and the grave. The audio tape filled in some of the silence, but not enough. Executive Assistant Prosecutor Ronald F. Delgeny had discussed the plea agreement with Britney's family before it was finalized. They had agreed to proceed. They wished to proceed with this plea agreement, Delaney said in court. It was a decision made, as such decisions often are, in exhaustion and grief, by people who needed the legal process to end so that anything resembling closure might begin. On January 13, 2006, Jack Fuller Jr., now 40 years old, returned to Superior Court in Toms River to be sentenced before Judge Grasso. He arrived in red prison scrubs, shaved head, wrist shackles. A vein pulsed visibly at his temple. He sat motionless and said nothing. The courtroom gallery was filled with Britney's family, her parents, her siblings, her extended relatives, all of them present to witness the formal conclusion of a legal process that had begun the morning she did not come home. Judge Grasso imposed the sentence agreed upon in the plea: 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Executive Assistant Prosecutor Robert Gasser addressed the court. It was a horrible, senseless killing. He said it was an intensely tragic event, particularly because of the fact that she was 16, a good student, and had a good life ahead of her. It really gripped not just Ocean County, it gripped the entire metropolitan area with the horror of seeking out the body and the lapse of 16 days until the body was found. Under New Jersey law at the time, Fuller had been eligible for the death penalty. The plea agreement took that option off the table. He would not seek parole. He would not be a free man until at the earliest he was well into his 70s if he lived that long. The case had consumed nearly 2 years of legal proceedings, mobilized hundreds of officers, and drawn national media attention. It had produced a confession so cold that even those trained to hear such things found it difficult to fully absorb. Deborah Gregory did not make a formal statement that day. She had already said what needed to be said in courtrooms, on courthouse steps, in the raw and unvarnished language of a mother who had lost the child she called her prize. No sentence she knew would restore what had been taken. The murder of Britney Gregory demonstrated with devastating clarity that the greatest threat a person can face is not always the unknown. Sometimes it is the man who already knows your father's name, the one who shows up at the door looking for someone else and stays just long enough to offer a favor. Britney Gregory had done nothing wrong. She was a 16-year-old girl who wanted to see her boyfriend and did not want to wait 45 minutes. She trusted a man who had been woven into the edges of her family for years. She got into his car, and when he behaved in a way that was beneath human decency, she said so. That act, the simple, ordinary act of standing up for herself, cost her her life. Her brother, William, said losing Britney taught him to stop taking time for granted. Her classmates said she made everything nicer. Her mother said she was a prize plucked from heaven. She had wanted to be a forensic scientist. She was 16 years old with straight A's and blue eyes and a future that had barely started. Jack Fuller Jr. took all of it and gave nothing back. Heather Gumina was born on February 27, 1986 in Placerville, California, a small gold rush town tucked into the foothills of El Dorado County east of Sacramento. She grew up surrounded by the quiet rural beauty of Northern California, pine trees, winding back roads, small communities where everybody knew everybody, and where life could feel both peaceful and isolated at the same time. By her early 30s, Heather was living in the Pleasant Valley area of El Dorado County, a community even further out from the city, the kind of place where neighbors are few and distances between homes can belong. She was raising 3 children, a teenager, a 10-year-old, and a 4-year-old who depended on her completely. She was not their world, she was the world. She worked as a waitress. Her former boss, Jeanette Waldo, later remembered her as someone who showed up, who pushed through, who kept going even when things were hard. She was not the kind of woman who stayed home when life got difficult. She got up and worked anyway. Her best friend, Rachel Rodriguez, described her with warmth and immediacy. A hard-working, loving mom, someone who smiled constantly, someone who lifted the people around her. Her mother, Joanna Russell, called her one of the most giving and loyal people she had ever known. She drove a black 2005 Infiniti G35, distinctive with pink accents and a pink gas cap lid that read as Queen. Pink was Heather's color. It showed up in her clothes, in her accessories, in the way people remembered her. She was the kind of person you noticed, not because she was loud, but because her warmth filled the space around her. And like so many women whose stories end in tragedy, the danger in Heather's life was not coming from a stranger. It was coming from inside the home. Anthony John Gumina, known to people who knew him as Tony, was a local man from the Pleasant Valley area. He was in his mid-40s, and he had known this community his whole life. At least one neighbor remembered him from childhood, a man named Bob Gately, who told reporters that Anthony had always seemed like trouble. He remembered Anthony as a kid who shot pellet guns at birds in neighboring trees. "I always saw him as a kid who was going to get in trouble someday." Gately said Anthony had already been in trouble, long before Heather's name entered any case file. Court records revealed he had prior convictions for selling and possessing methamphetamine. He had already had contact with the criminal justice system. He was not an unknown quantity, but to the people who cared about him, including some family members, Anthony presented a different face. His first cousin, Robert Shawaluk, told local media that he had grown up with Anthony and insisted he was not a murderer. He acknowledged the marriage had been rough, but said Anthony loved Heather. The contradiction in those two portraits, the dangerous man and the loving husband, is central to everything that happened next. By early 2019, Heather and Anthony were in a relationship that had already begun showing the signs that experts in domestic violence recognize as escalation warning flags: control, fear, and the presence of a young child inside a home where violence had already happened. On January 31, 2019, things exploded. According to prosecutors, Anthony tackled Heather to the ground. Heather grabbed her 4-year-old child and tried to get to safety. They ran to the bathroom and locked the door, but Anthony kicked the door in. Heather managed to call 911. Anthony was arrested. He was charged with felony domestic violence. For a moment, the system seemed to be working. There was an arrest. There was a charge. Heather had been brave enough to call for help, to let the police come, to let the process begin. Her 4-year-old child had watched all of it. The tackle, the locked door, the kicked-in door, and then the police arriving to take Anthony away. But Anthony was later released from custody over the prosecution's objection. The case against him remained open, and Heather remained in El Dorado County in the same rural community, not far from the man who had just been charged with attacking her. 1 month after the bathroom door was kicked in, Heather and Anthony got married. February 2019, 1 month. That is not a typo. For people who have never lived inside a domestic violence relationship, that timeline seems impossible to understand. But for researchers, advocates, and survivors, it is heartbreakingly familiar. The cycle of abuse is not a straight line, it is a spiral. The violence happens. Then comes the apology, the promise, the tenderness, the explanation. It won't happen again. I was scared, I love you, I need you. And when a person is isolated, financially dependent, in love, or simply afraid of what happens if they leave, the pullback into the relationship can be overwhelming. Heather and Anthony married in February 2019. The felony domestic violence case was still pending. She was still the alleged victim. She was still the expected witness. She was now also his wife. The months after the wedding were a slow compression of danger. Anthony's domestic violence case was moving through the courts. That meant hearings, timelines, and eventually a trial or a plea. Either way, Heather's account of what had happened on January 31st was critical. She was the witness. She was the victim. Her testimony, her presence was essential to the prosecution's case. And Anthony knew it. Life inside the Pleasant Valley home continued. Heather still worked. She still mothered her 3 children. From the outside, or to people who did not know what was happening behind closed doors, she was simply a woman living her life in a rural part of Northern California. But behind those closed doors, Anthony had a pending felony case that depended in part on what Heather would say and whether she would say anything at all. On July 15, 2019, the violence escalated again, and this time it was severe enough to send Heather to the hospital. Prosecutors said Anthony broke Heather's collarbone. The details of exactly how it happened were not fully disclosed in public reporting, but the outcome was clear. Heather needed medical treatment. She ended up in a hospital. She was given a sling. She was issued a hospital ID bracelet. She was given medical instructions and sent home. She did not call 911 this time. She did not report it to police, but she did reach out to the one person she trusted completely, her mother. From the hospital, Heather sent Joanna Russell a text message. The words in that text were some of the most devastating in the entire case. She wrote that Anthony had tried to kill her, that he had strangled her repeatedly until she almost passed out. She was still at the hospital when she sent those words. She had a broken collarbone. She was in a medical sling. She had a bracelet on her wrist that identified her as a patient, and then she went back home. The morning of July 16, 2019 began with Heather's mother present in the home. According to prosecutors, Heather and Anthony argued, and the argument was about the broken collarbone. Specifically, it was about what that injury would mean for Anthony's pending domestic violence case. Heather was visibly hurt. She was still wearing her sling. The collarbone injury was impossible to hide, impossible to explain away, and critically, it was new evidence of ongoing violence that could be used against Anthony in court. According to the prosecution's theory, that was what Anthony feared most. Not the injury itself, not what Heather was suffering, but what her body, bruised, fractured, documented by hospital staff, would look like to the district attorney who was already building a case against him. Heather's mother was present for the argument, and then at some point she left. What happened next, Anthony eventually admitted in open court. He slammed Heather onto the floor. He used his forearm to pin her right arm above her head, and he pressed down on her throat. He held that position, pressing down until she stopped breathing, until she went still, until Heather Gumina was dead. She was 33 years old. Her children were 4, 10, and 14. Her hospital bracelet was still on her wrist. Within hours of Heather's death, Anthony made a phone call. He called Joanna Russell, Heather's mother, the same woman who had just been in that house, the same woman who had received the text from the hospital just the day before. He told her that Heather had taken off, that she was missing, that she had run off somewhere, and he didn't know where she was. Heather's mother did not believe it for a second. She knew her daughter. She knew Heather would not leave her children. She knew something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. Joanna told reporters during the search that Heather was not the kind of mother who simply walked away. She said that her youngest grandson kept wandering through the house looking for his mother. She said she was dying inside. But for now, the public story was what Anthony had told. A missing woman, a wife who had vanished, a mystery, and Anthony had a head start. Heather was formally reported missing on July 19, 2019, 3 days after Anthony killed her. El Dorado County Sheriff's investigators began working the case. The public was asked to look out for Heather. Her photos circulated on social media. Friends and family drove the rural roads of Pleasant Valley, Grizzly Flat, Somerset, and Omo Ranch. They searched wilderness areas and back roads. Heather's distinctive car, the black 2005 Infiniti G35 with pink accents and the pink gas cap that read his queen, became a central focus of the search. It was easy to spot. People were looking for it everywhere. In August 2019, the car was found in El Dorado County. It was processed by forensic investigators, but Heather was not with it. The discovery of the car deepened the mystery for the family and the public. It was evidence. It was a lead. But it also meant that wherever Heather was, she wasn't in her car. And that raised more questions than it answered. For weeks, her family kept searching. For weeks, Anthony kept presenting himself as a grieving, confused husband. On September 6, 2019, 7 weeks and 3 days after Anthony killed Heather, detectives moved. They served a search warrant in the Pleasant Valley area. While executing that warrant, they found Anthony on an outstanding no-bail domestic violence warrant and took him into custody. And then during the search, they found what they had come looking for. Human remains buried several feet underground on a nearby property. Heather's body had been wrapped in carpet. A rope, the same rope Anthony later admitted he had used to help move her body out of the house, was around her neck, formed into a noose, and on her wrist, a hospital ID bracelet. On her shoulder, a sling. She was still wearing the evidence of what he had done to her the day before he killed her. She had gone from the hospital to home to the ground. And through all of it, through the cover-up and the search and the weeks of her family's desperate hope, she had been right there in the hills of Pleasant Valley, waiting to be found. The coroner confirmed her identity. The investigation pivoted from missing person to homicide. Anthony was charged with murder. The investigation did not end with Anoni's arrest. By June 2021, a second man entered the case. Justin Kamir, 40 years old, was arrested on suspicion of being an accessory to Heather's murder. Authorities said continuing investigation and new evidence led them to believe Kamir had played a role, though the exact nature of that role and his connection to Anthony and Heather was not publicly released at the time. Court records showed Kamir had a lengthy criminal history in El Dorado County, with prior arrests involving stolen vehicles, shoplifting, and financial fraud. His bail was set at $320,000. The final disposition of Kamir's case was not clearly established in public reporting available at the time of this script's preparation. If you are watching this and know more, drop it in the comments below. On June 23, 2021, Anthony John Gumina stood in a courtroom filled with Heather's family and friends, and he pleaded guilty first-degree murder. 2 felony domestic violence incidents involving Heather. He admitted in open court what he had done. The floor, the forearm, the throat, the pressure, the stillness. He admitted using the rope to move her body out of the house. Prosecutors said he initially tried to justify his actions, that he blamed Heather for hurting his pride and honor. CBS Sacramento reported that a family friend and attorney for Heather's family said Anthony had started by trying to explain himself. Heather's family rejected that framing. The district attorney rejected that framing. The system slowly, incompletely, 2 years after Heather was killed, finally got it right. On September 3, 2021, Anthony Gumina was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, as Heather's family read victim impact statements, Anthony did not turn around to face them. He stared forward, but he looked up when a slideshow began. Photos of Heather, her life, her children, her smile. Joanna Russell, Heather's mother, spoke about the cycle of domestic abuse that had led to her daughter's death. She said Heather had not made it out. She said Anthony had fooled many people. She called his behavior a web of lies and alibis. At least one of Anthony's longtime friends was there to say that it was a crime of passion, that Anthony was not a monster. Heather's family and prosecutors pushed back on that framing directly and forcefully. CBS Sacramento reported that there was not one dry eye in the courtroom. Forensic analysis from a forensic and legal standpoint. The Heather Gumina case is a study in how physical evidence can outlast a perpetrator's efforts to bury it literally. The most remarkable evidentiary detail is the state in which Heather's body was discovered. She was still wearing her hospital identification bracelet, her medical sling, and her smock from the July 15th hospital visit. This is not merely haunting, it is forensically significant. Those items created a documented dated physical chain linking the prior assault, the hospital visit, and the murder into a single undeniable timeline. Anthony could not argue the collarbone injury was unrelated to him. He could not create distance between July 15th and July 16th. The hospital itself had recorded what Heather looked like the day before she died. The rope used to move the body, which Anthony admitted to in court, also became critical. It demonstrated post-mortem handling, which prosecutors used to establish both premeditation in the cover-up and Anoni's awareness that what he had done was criminal. People who kill impulsively typically do not plan the disposal of the body. Anthony did. The timeline of the missing person report July 19th, 3 days after the murder, also matters. That gap represents 3 days in which Anthony was free to control the narrative, dispose of evidence, and establish the story of a woman who had simply run off. The 3-day delay may have allowed him to set a cover story in place before investigators began asking serious questions. The recovery of Heather's car in August, before her remains were found in September, was another brick in the forensic wall. Cars carry trace evidence, fibers, hair, fingerprints, and the fact that investigators processed it separately added another layer to the case before the body was located. The prosecution's charging decision, first-degree murder, not second-degree, reflected their confidence that this was premeditated. The argument about the broken collarbone and what it would mean for Anthony's court case established in their view that Anthony had a reason to kill Heather that he had been calculating before he acted. Psychological analysis. The psychological profile of Anthony Gumina, as established by the public record without amateur diagnosis, reflects a behavioral pattern that researchers in domestic violence call coercive controlling violence. This is distinct from situational couple violence, which is more impulsive and mutual. Coercive controlling violence is strategic, calculated, and designed to maintain dominance over a partner. Anthony's behavior across the case demonstrates several key markers. Physical violence to establish dominance. The January attack escalation to include strangulation reported in Heather's hospital text. The use of surveillance and control. An argument about what Heather's injuries would look like to the DA implies Anthony was actively monitoring her connection to the legal system. And ultimately, lethal violence timed to a perceived threat to his own freedom. The most psychologically revealing detail is what prosecutors described at sentencing. Anthony tried to justify the killing by blaming Heather for hurting his pride and honor. This is externalized blame, a core feature of abusive thinking. In his framework, the problem was not what he had done to Heather. The problem was what Heather's existence as a witness represented to him. The marriage in February 2019, 1 month after the felony arrest, also speaks to the psychological dynamics at play. Abusers often use marriage as a tactic after a violent incident, either as a genuine attempt at reconciliation or as a way to complicate a partner's legal standing and willingness to testify. Whether Anthony's proposal was calculated or emotionally driven, the outcome was the same. Heather became his wife while he was her alleged attacker. Heather's behavior, returning to the relationship, not calling 911 on July 15th, going back home from the hospital, should never be read as passive acceptance. Survivors of coercive controlling violence operate under genuine threat calculations. Leaving is the most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship. Heather's best friend said she had no idea what Heather was enduring behind the scenes. That invisibility, the gap between Heather's public smile and her private danger, is itself a symptom of how thoroughly Anthony had isolated and managed her world. Anthony John Gumina is currently serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole. As of April 2025 public reporting, he was at San Quentin State Prison. The only DNA investigators possessed to identify a killer was a speck so tiny it was invisible to the naked eye, 0.4 nanograms, recovered from a 12-year-old girl's skirt in 1964. Stored in a freezer at the Elmira Police Department since her death, preserving the DNA unknown to detectives and investigators at the time. For 61 years, that sample rested in that freezer while the case went cold and the leads dried up, and the detectives who worked it retired and died and were replaced by detectives who inherited their files and their frustration. Then in 2022, an FBI special agent named Kenneth Jensen packed that sample in dry ice inside a cooler and shipped it to a laboratory in Texas that specializes in doing the impossible with degraded evidence. Then everything halted. An ice storm had shut down the FedEx hub in Memphis, the largest in the world, where the package was routed. The shipment sat stranded. If the dry ice gave out, decades of waiting would end in irreversible loss. We couldn't even get a hold of anyone at FedEx during the historic storm. When DNA is tested, it is consumed in the process. There was no second sample, no backup, no second chance. This was it. This was the last shot at justice for a 12-year-old girl who had been waiting 61 years for someone to say the name of the man who killed her. The resolution of Mary Simpson's murder marks one of the oldest homicide cases in the United States to be solved using forensic genetic genealogy. This is how it happened. Mary Therese Simpson was born in 1951 in Elmira, New York, to Ellsworth and Rose Simpson. She had an older brother and an older sister. After her parents separated in May 1963, she lived with her father. By the accounts of everyone who knew her, she was as an ordinary 12-year-old girl in the specific way that makes the word ordinary mean something beautiful. She loved to dance. She was always happy. She never hurt anyone. She had the kind of face that made adults smile without knowing why. She lived with her father on the east side of Elmira. She visited relatives regularly, the close-knit pattern of a family that stayed connected even after the separation. On Sunday, March 15, 1964, she spent the afternoon visiting relatives near East Market and Harriet Streets. She was last seen heading home at about 6:30 p.m. at the corner of East Market and Harriet Streets. Her father reported her missing at 10:30 p.m., 4 hours. The distance between the last time anyone saw her alive and the moment her father picked up the phone. In those 4 hours, the city of Elmira went from being the ordinary safe place that 12-year-old girls walked home through on Sunday evenings to being something else entirely. The kind of place where a father sits by the phone as the minutes stretch past the point where there is a comfortable explanation. 4 days later, on March 19th, Mary's body was discovered in a wooded area near Combs Hill Road in Southport by a man hiking with his sons. Her remains had been partially concealed under debris and large stones. Investigators determined she had been sexually assaulted and strangled, and her mouth had been stuffed with twigs and dirt. Her body was discovered in a wooded section of Southport beneath twigs, branches, leaves, dirt, and 4 heavy stones, the largest weighing more than 100 pounds, by a man who was walking with his 2 sons near Combs Hill Road. Only part of her hand and a sneaker were visible, 7 miles from where she had been standing at 6:30 the previous Sunday evening. Her body was hidden with debris and 4 heavy stones, the largest weighing more than 100 pounds. Whoever had done this had not been rushing. This was intentional. This was someone who remained long enough to conceal what they had done. The investigation started almost immediately. Detectives across Elmira swarmed the area. Officers went door to door. Tips started pouring in. Witnesses were questioned for hours. People across the community came forward with anything they thought might help. More than 300 people were questioned, including those as far away as Arizona. The Star-Gazette reported that 7 suspects agreed to take lie detector tests, and still no charges were filed. The reward money was donated to a charity in Mary's name. Occasional anniversary stories appeared in the Star-Gazette, raising the reward to $5,000. And still nothing despite hundreds of tips being called in. Every lead was pursued. Every suspect cleared. The physical evidence was collected and logged and stored. Mary's clothing, the items near the scene, everything a 1964 investigation could document. And then a specific choice was made by detectives who could not have understood its significance. Mary's clothing was placed in a freezer, not evidence storage at room temperature, a freezer. That decision, made by investigators who had no concept of DNA, made in a year when the structure of DNA had only been understood for 11 years, made in a department that was doing everything right without knowing the most important thing they were doing, preserved 0.4 nanograms of biological material that would sit undisturbed for 6 decades. Nobody knew they had just preserved the answer. The investigation eventually became cold. The files were retained, the case stayed open, but lacking a break, it had nowhere to go. And Elmira moved ahead in the way that cities move ahead, not forgetting exactly, but absorbing the grief into daily life of a community that had no other choice. Please go into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And had you heard of the Mary Teresa Simpson case before today? The case never fully closed in the minds of the people who handled it. Every few years, a new detective would review the files. Every anniversary of her disappearance, the local newspaper would publish something. A reminder that she was still out there, that the question was still open, that whoever had covered her body with 4 heavy stones had never been forced to answer for it. The reward sat at $5,000 for years. Tips came in, none of them lasted. In 2000, 36 years later after Mary's death, the New York State Police Forensic Lab examined her clothing more carefully than had been possible in 1964. Technology had advanced significantly. DNA had been used in criminal prosecution since 1986. The lab found something on Mary's skirt. DNA found from semen on her skirt was entered into a national DNA database, but there were no matches. The CODIS database, the combined DNA index system maintained by the FBI, contains DNA profiles from individuals convicted of qualifying offenses. When new evidence is submitted, it is automatically compared against every profile in the system. A match means a name. No match means the person who left that DNA had either never been arrested for a qualifying crime or had never been swabbed. The killer's DNA went into CODIS in 2003. Nothing came back. It was resubmitted again in 2014, still nothing. 11 more years had passed. The database had grown significantly. More profiles, more comparisons, more opportunities for a match. Still nothing. The man who killed Mary Teresa Simpson had apparently never been arrested for a crime that required a DNA sample. He had moved through the criminal justice system, if he had moved through it at all, without ever leaving a genetic record. He was invisible to the system in the one way that mattered most. Murray was known to police at the time regarding other matters. He had some type of record, but whatever it was not the type of offense that required a DNA swab. And without that swab, he remained invisible. This is the point in the investigation that should feel hopeless. 2 CODIS submissions, 2 returns of nothing. The technology that was supposed to solve this case had been tried twice and come back empty both times. The case had every reason to go permanently cold. Then something changed in the broader world of forensic science that nobody in Elmira had expected. The technology that solved the Golden State Killer in 2018, forensic genetic genealogy, opened a completely different pathway. Instead of searching for a direct DNA match in a criminal database, genealogical DNA analysis searched for relatives, family members who had submitted DNA to consumer ancestry platforms, second cousins, people who had no idea their DNA test was about to help solve a 1964 murder in a city they might never have visited. The resolution of Mary Simpson's murder marks one of the oldest homicide cases in the United States to be solved using forensic genetic genealogy. The problem was that the sample on Mary's skirt, 0.4 nanograms, was nearly too small to work with. Standard genealogical DNA analysis required a more substantial profile. This would require a lab that specialized in extracting usable sequences from degraded minimal evidence. A lab that could do the impossible with material that other labs could not process. That lab existed. It was in the Woodlands, Texas. It was called Autumn Technologies. Getting the sample to Autumn required funding, and getting the funding required one sergeant in the Elmira Police Department to believe that after 58 years, the answer was still discoverable if someone was willing to try one more time. Sergeant William Goodwin had been working Mary Teresa Simpson's case for years by the time he applied for the grant. He was a cold case detective in the Elmira Police Department. He had pulled the files. He had reviewed the evidence logs. He had seen the entry about the clothing in the freezer and the CODIS submissions that returned nothing. He had studied the reports from the officers who handled the case in 1964. Men who had knocked on hundreds of doors and pursued hundreds of leads and come up empty every time. And he had looked at the advances in forensic genealogy that had started producing results on cases nobody thought could be solved. In 2022, after requesting a grant in partnership with the FBI, EPD announced that it received funding from a nonprofit organization that helps fund cold case investigations. This funding was allocated to having DNA found on Simpson's blouse in 2000 tested and analyzed by a forensic laboratory in Texas. The nonprofit was called Season of Justice. Their purpose is precisely this: providing funding for investigative agencies and families to move cold cases forward when government resources are insufficient. They said yes. The grant funded the submission of Mary's clothing to Autumn Technologies in the Woodlands, Texas. In February 2023, forensic evidence from the case was submitted to Autumn's laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas. Autumn scientists developed a usable DNA extract from the evidence and applied forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a comprehensive DNA profile of the unknown suspect. But getting the evidence to Othram was not straightforward. FBI Special Agent Kenneth Jensen, who was assisting the Elmira Police Department in New York, knew what was at stake. If this sample failed, the case would likely die with it. He packed the delicate evidence in dry ice in a cooler and sent it to a lab in Texas known for doing the impossible with damaged DNA. Then everything froze. An ice storm had shut down the FedEx hub in Memphis, the largest in the world, where the package was routed. The shipment sat stranded. Jensen watched the tracking. The parcel was not moving. The Memphis hub, by which a massive percentage of FedEx shipments are routed, was entirely shut down by the ice storm. The dry ice inside the cooler was not enduring. It was bought especially for this shipment based on the expected transit time. Every added hour the parcel sat stranded was an hour closer to the dry ice giving out. If the temperature inside the cooler rose, the evidence would be compromised. When DNA testing is performed, the DNA itself is consumed in the process. There was no going back, no second sample, no backup preserved for exactly this contingency. This was the last of the evidence, 0.4 nanograms, invisible to the naked eye, sitting in a stranded FedEx parcel in a Memphis hub that Jensen could not reach on the phone. He waited. The storm broke. The parcel moved. It arrived in Texas intact. The dry ice had held. Othram scientists developed a usable DNA extract from the evidence and applied forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a comprehensive DNA profile of the unknown suspect. The genetic profile extracted from the DNA sample by Othram was uploaded to public databases. At that point, the FBI began pursuing genetic genealogy, building extended family trees, and narrowing down possible candidates based on a number of factors, including age, location, and historical records. A suspect emerged, not by name in a single file, a genetic shadow of a person who had left 0.4 nanograms of biological material on a 12-year-old girl's clothing 61 years ago and had apparently never thought it would matter. The case gained momentum between 2024 and 2025 when EPD, the FBI, and New York State Police began conducting interviews with possible relatives within the family tree of the suspect profile. The genealogy search produced family connections, distant relatives, whose DNA was in public ancestry database. From those relatives, investigators built outward, constructing a family tree, cross-referencing historical records, narrowing the candidates by age and location, and what was known about who had been in Elmira in March 1964. The suspect was listed as John Doe in the case documentation, a genetic profile indicating a specific family, a specific location, a specific span of time. Throughout 2024 and into 2025, law enforcement conducted additional interviews, leading them to a man believed to be a family member of John Doe. That person submitted a buccal DNA sample for further testing. A living family member voluntarily submitted a DNA sample. They did not know what they were contributing to. They cooperated with investigators who explained they were working on a cold case and needed help. The buccal swab took seconds. The result took longer. Testing from the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center confirmed a paternal relationship to the DNA recovered from Mary Teresa's clothing. The living family member was the biological son of the man who killed Mary Teresa Simpson. That confirmation pointed investigators toward one name, Alfred Murray Jr. He was an Elmira resident who died at age 73 in March 2004, almost 40 years to the day after Mary Simpson went missing. Murray was a U.S. Army veteran of the Korean War and was married with several children and grandchildren, according to his obituary. Murray was 32 years old when he allegedly killed 12-year-old Mary Teresa Simpson. He was a Korean War veteran, a husband, a father, a truck driver, a man who had lived an ordinary visible life in the same city where he had committed the worst act of his existence. He had attended community events. He had grandchildren. His obituary had been written and published in the local paper when he died in 2004. He had been dead for 20 years by the time his name emerged from the genealogy search. He was not in CODIS. He had never submitted DNA. Of the hundreds of people interviewed in 1964, he may have been among them. Murray was known to police at the time in relation to other matters. Known to police. Living in the same city. Never connected. Investigators needed one more confirmation. A familial DNA match through a living son was powerful evidence. But there was one more step available. One more confirmation that would close every remaining gap. Murray was buried in Elmira. The genealogy search produced a name. Then it produced a living person willing to submit a DNA sample. Then it produced a grave in Elmira, New York. And then investigators did something that changed everything. They exhumed him. In November 2025, investigators exhumed the grave of Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. in Elmira, New York. What they found confirmed something that had been true since March 15, 1964, and ends with a detail about where Murray is buried that nobody at the press conference thought to mention. But the strangest part of this case is where Murray was buried the whole time, a detail almost nobody noticed. Most people think cases like this are random. They're not. The same mistakes, the same warning signs, the same moments of vulnerability appear again and again. After the confirmation of the DNA from the family member in November of 2025, Elmira Police and the District Attorney's Office exhumed the grave of John Doe with financial assistance, thanks to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, for testing by forensic anthropologist from Detroit, Michigan. Biological samples from the exhumation of the body for comparison testing matched the DNA from the sperm found on Mary Teresa Simpson's clothing. They found that the odds of that DNA belonging to another person were less than 1 in 320 billion. On February 10, 2026, members of the Elmira Police Department held a media conference to discuss the developments that led to the closure of the case involving the 1964 murder of Simpson, including the identification of the person found responsible. Elmira Police Sergeant William Goodwin unveiled Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. as the sole suspect in the murder and assault of 12-year-old Mary Teresa Simpson in 1964. According to police, Murray had no known connection to Mary Teresa Simpson or her family. He did not know her. She did not know him. She was walking home from her relative's house on a Sunday evening, and he was a 32-year-old man who encountered her on that route and made a decision that ended her life and went undetected for 61 years. He was never tried. He was never convicted. He died in 2004, almost 40 years to the day after Mary Simpson went missing. March 15, 1964, March 18, 2004. 3 days apart, 6 decades apart. He spent the last 4 decades of his life in Elmira, raised his family there. He had grandchildren there. He attended church there, perhaps, went to the grocery store and the hardware store, and lived the ordinary, visible life of a man with no significant criminal record in the same mid-sized city where he had hidden a 12-year-old girl under 4 heavy stones in a wooded area and stuffed her mouth with dirt and twigs and walked away. Officials say that the investigation revealed no signs that Murray had any relation to Simpson or her family. He had no reason to know her. He chose her anyway. And then he lived with that choice for 40 years until his heart stopped, and he was buried in Elmira. He is still there in the same city. This is the detail that the press conference did not dwell on. Not the 1 in 320 billion probability. Not the ice storm that nearly destroyed the last evidence. Not the 61 years of waiting. The man who killed Mary Teresa Simpson is buried in Elmira, New York. The same city where she grew up. The same city where her family has lived. The same city where the Elmira Police Department kept her clothing in a freezer for 61 years without knowing what it was preserving. He cannot be prosecuted. He cannot be sentenced. He cannot stand in a courtroom and hear what he did to a family pronounced out loud by a judge. The DA's office confirmed he died before they could bring charges. The matter is closed. He is identified. He cannot be reached. What the family has is the name and the awareness that 0.4 nanograms of evidence, unseen to the naked eye, preserved by detectives who had no idea what DNA was, endured 61 years in a freezer, and survived an ice storm in Memphis, and survived every technical obstacle that stood between 1964 and 2026 to speak his name out loud. Simpson's clothing was kept in a freezer at the EPD since her death, preserving the DNA unknown to detectives and investigators at the time. That choice, made without any awareness of its significance, is the reason this case was solved. If you have a loved one who is an unsolved homicide victim, ask the investigating agency one question. Was physical evidence preserved, and has it been submitted to a genealogical DNA lab, not just CODIS, genealogical, using current technology? That question is free. For Mary Teresa Simpson, it took 61 years and an ice storm and 0.4 nanograms of evidence to get the answer. But the answer was always there, in a freezer in Elmira waiting. Mary Teresa Simpson was 12 years old. She walked home on a Sunday evening in March 1964 and never arrived. Her clothing went into a freezer. 61 years later, that clothing gave her family the name they had been awaiting 6 decades to hear. Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. was 32 years old when he killed her. He died in 2004 at 73 years old in the same city where he buried her under 4 heavy stones. He is still there. He never faced a courtroom. What he could not escape was a speck of DNA smaller than anything the naked eye can see, preserved by detectives who had no idea what they were saving, waiting with endless patience for the world to develop the technology to read it. It waited 61 years. It was worth the wait.